Good day everybody. Today we're going to look at Lecture 5, Parables, Challenges and Peter. That's Matthew 13 to 16. Many see chapter 13, which is the chapter on the parables, as setting off a new focus in St. Matthew's Gospel. Chapters 1 to 12, which we finished last week, have Jesus presenting the kingdom, preaching the kingdom, and inviting people to join him. Then from this chapter on, until the end really, we're looking a little bit at why did Jesus fail in his attempt to bring the Jewish people into the new kingdom, to understand the kingdom as he was preaching it. And we're also going to focus a little bit on the new alternative community that Jesus founds. Well, chapter 13 is the one on the parables. And Matthew is going to use these parables to explain why the Jewish people didn't accept Jesus. Then in chapters 14 to 16, we'll have a little bit on the challenges that faced Jesus in his preaching, and a little bit on the new community, how we're meant to act. And then chapter 16, we're going to look at St. Peter and how Jesus founds this new community. All right, first off, the parables. In chapter 13, Matthew gives us 7 parables, 3 of which he also adds interpretations. By this parable I mean da-da-da. Now these interpretations don't really come from Jesus himself. The parables do, the interpretations don't. They come from the later church as they look at Jesus' parables and see how they could be understood for us in our new context. And these 3 parables which have interpretations are the parable of the sower, the parable of the weeds, and the parable of the dragnet. But as well as these 7 parables, 3 of which have interpretations, there are also 3 very significant times that Matthew reflects on the parables. And he fits them into the wider structure of his story. So, just to look at all that, I'd like to look only at one parable, and that is the parable of the sower. We'll look firstly at the original parable that Jesus gave, that he spoke to the people of his day. Then we'll look secondly at the later church interpretation. And finally, we're going to look at some reflections that Matthew has about how this parable fits in to the wider context of his story. First off, then, the parable, verses 3 to 9, and I'll read it. He said, "Imagine a sower going out to sow. As he sowed, some seeds fell on the edge of the path, and the birds came and ate them up. Others fell on patches of rock, where they found little soil and sprang up straight away because there was no depth of earth. But as soon as the sun came up, they were scorched, and not having any roots, they withered away. Others fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. But others fell on rich soil and produced their crop, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Listen, anyone who has ears to listen." That's roughly how Jesus would have given this parable when he first spoke. And he used simple parables like this, mostly taken from nature, this is the sower, to challenge the thinking of people, to extend their imagination, to shock them even. Because what he was saying didn't make normal sense. You had to rethink about it. You had to think about it, rather. So, what would the listeners have been surprised about? Well, they'd be surprised about the fact that so much seed seemed to be wasted. It was thrown everywhere, thrown liberally, thrown wildly almost, everywhere. Of course, that's Jesus, that's the sower. Jesus is the sower. He's throwing the Word of God everywhere. And it gets a mixed response, of course. But he's so confident, this sower, that when it finds the right soil, it'll be worth it. Because there'll be an extraordinary growth in that person. So that's the parable. That's what he said. He gave the Word of God everywhere, and when it did hit home, it was worth it. It was fantastic. And he adds, listen, anybody who has ears to listen. And of course, as he says that, people think of what they know and recite every day. From Deuteronomy chapter 6 verse 4, listen, Israel. Your God is the one God. You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, etc., etc. Listen, Israel. Listen, anyone who has ears to listen. The Shema, the great confession, the great profession of faith that every Jew would recite every day. Okay, that's first. Now let's listen to the interpretation which comes from the church sometime later. It's from verses 18 to 23, and we'll read that now. You therefore are to hear the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom without understanding, the evil one comes and carries off what was sown in his or her heart. This is the person who received the seed on the edge of the path. The one who received it on patches of rock is the person who hears the word and welcomes it at once with immense joy. But that person has no roots. They don't last. Let some trial come or some persecution on account of the word, and they fall away at once. The one who receives the seed in thorns is the person who hears the word, but the worries of this world and the lure of riches choke the word, and so they produce nothing. And the one who receives the seed in rich soil is the person who hears the word and understands it. They are the ones who yield a harvest and produce now 100-fold, now 60, now 30. So the early church picks up some of these parables of Jesus and adapts them in two different types of way. The first is they might exploit the riddle aspect of the parable, relating it to the trauma of Israel's rejection of Jesus as the Messiah. The fact that they couldn't get what Jesus was on about is all part of God's plan. For them, it came across as a riddle. And another way that the early church adapted those simple parables of Jesus was to turn them into what we call an allegory. And an allegory is an interpretation of something which connects a whole range of details within the story to different aspects of life now. So, we have here an allegory. The church's interpretation is an allegory because it looks at the question not of why don't people welcome the faith, which is how Jesus gave it. They look at the question of why do people give up the faith? Why don't they hang in there for the long haul? And of course, the allegory